Welcome to our deep dive today. Um, as philosophers, we're all pretty familiar with bioethics, right? But we're going a bit beyond that. Today, we're going to look at things from a feminist perspective on bioethics,
Mhm.
explore how that changes things.
That's a really key point. Feminist bioethics isn't about just adding women to the mix. It's really about changing the whole framework, how we think about ethical problems in medicine and the life sciences.
And our guide for all this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on feminist bioethics, which is freshly updated, perfect for us. So how does this feminist lens actually shift our thinking? What's different?
Well, one of the biggest differences is how feminist philosophy challenges the traditional idea of the moral subject in
Right.
bioethics. Usually, bioethics presents this very kind of like detached, rational mind making decisions, all in a vacuum. But feminist bioethics emphasizes embodiment and relationships.
Well, that's interesting. So it's moving away from that classic, I think, therefore I am, and recognizing that our physical bodies and our social connections actually shape our moral decision making. That's a pretty big shift.
It is. Think about informed consent. I mean, as a philosopher, you've definitely spent some time with this concept. And traditional bioethics often focuses on, the procedures. Did the patient sign the form? But feminist bioethics asks us to think about the patient's social context, their power dynamics with healthcare providers, how their lived experiences, especially as embodied individuals, might influence their understanding and choices.
Right. That really complicates the seemingly simple act of getting informed consent. It's not just a signature on a form. It's a whole bunch of factors that traditional bioethics might overlook.
Exactly. And that brings us to a concept that's central to feminist bioethics, epistemic injustice.
Okay. Epistemic injustice. I think a lot of our listeners are going to want to hear more about this.
Essentially, epistemic injustice is about how social power structures can lead to some people's knowledge being ignored or dismissed, or even actively silenced. And this is really relevant in healthcare, where certain groups, historically and even presently, haven't had their experiences or knowledge valued.
Yeah, the vaginal mesh scandal is like a perfect example of this. I mean, women were reporting these really serious complications, but their concerns were dismissed by the medical community for years. And it took a long time for their knowledge and their embodied experiences to be taken seriously. And unfortunately, that delay caused a lot of harm.
And that's the crucial point. Feminist bioethics highlights how traditional approaches, by failing to recognize these power dynamics and the ways they shape knowledge, can actually contribute to harm. And it forces us to confront the question whose voices are heard and whose are silenced in healthcare.
And that question has really huge implications for how we understand truth and knowledge, which are, obviously core concerns for any philosopher.
Absolutely. Feminist epistemology, which is closely tied to feminist bioethics, really digs deep into how social factors shape what we consider knowledge and who gets to be considered a knower. This is essential for understanding issues like medical bias, healthcare disparities, and even the development of new technologies.
So we're seeing how this feminist lens starts to expose the limitations of those traditional bioethical frameworks. But what does it offer as an alternative? Where do we go from here?
Well, that's where care ethics comes in. It's like a key alternative, proposed by feminist bioethics, and it really challenges that individualistic focus of traditional ethics.
Care ethics. It sounds warm and fuzzy, but I have a feeling there's more to it than just being nice.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Care ethics is way more than just simple compassion. It's a whole ethical framework. It recognizes the importance of caregiving, interdependence, the whole web of relationships that sustains us.
So instead of these abstract principles like, autonomy or justice, care ethics is highlighting those concrete lived experiences of caring and being cared for. How does that actually play out in real-world issues?
Okay, well, think about healthcare systems. Traditional bioethics might focus on things like patient rights and resource allocation. But care ethics is asking us to consider the quality of the caregiving, the emotional labor involved, and the power dynamics between, caregivers and those receiving care.
Yeah, that's really relevant now with like the aging population and the increasing demand for elder care.
Hmm.
It forces us to think about not just the medical needs of the elderly, but also like the social and emotional support they need.
Exactly. And care ethics also shines a light on global care work, a field often marked by exploitation and gender inequality. It challenges us to recognize the value of this work and advocate for fair labor practices and just compensation.
These are all issues that traditional bioethics might not fully address, but they become really central when you think about care ethics. And speaking of traditional bioethics, how does care ethics challenge those assumptions about autonomy? That classic picture of the individual as this self-sufficient, rational agent making choices on their own.
Right. Well, this is where we get to the concept of relational autonomy. Feminist philosophers like Held and Mackenzie have argued that this traditional idea of autonomy is actually quite limited and, frankly, unrealistic. They're proposing that our autonomy is shaped by our relationships, not opposed to them.
So it's not denying individual agency, but acknowledging that it's always kind of embedded in the social context,
Yeah.
influenced by our connections with others.
Exactly. Our ability to make choices to live a good life is really intertwined with the care we receive and the care we give. Relational autonomy recognizes that our identities and even our capacity for, self-determination are developed and sustained within a whole network of relationships.
That has like major implications for how we think about ethical dilemmas in healthcare. For instance, if a patient's decision is heavily influenced by, family pressures or cultural expectations, can we really say they're acting autonomously?
That's a great question. And it's one that relational autonomy really forces us to confront. It requires us to go beyond these simple ideas of individual choice and consider the really complex interplay of factors that influence someone's decision making. And this can be really challenging in healthcare, where patients are often in vulnerable positions and their autonomy can be easily compromised.
So feminist bioethics is really urging us to rethink autonomy knowledge and even the self. It's not just adding women to the mix. It's a fundamental shift in how we approach these ethical issues. But as you mentioned earlier, feminist bioethics goes beyond just medical ethics. How does this play out in other areas?
That's where things get really exciting. Feminist bioethics is expanding to address a whole range of issues, things like food ethics and climate change, even the ethical implications of AI in healthcare.
Those might seem like very different topics, but I'm guessing there's a common thread running through them.
Absolutely. The common thread is a concern for justice, for challenging power structures, and recognizing the interconnectedness of all living beings. For example, in the realm of food ethics, feminist bioethicists are examining the power dynamics within the food system, the exploitation of workers, and the impact of food production on the environment.
It's about understanding how our everyday choices, like what we eat, are tied to these broader social and ecological systems. It's also about recognizing how those systems can perpetuate these inequalities and harm.
Precisely. And when it comes to climate change, feminist bioethics highlights the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation on women, especially in the global south. It challenges us to consider the ethical implications of our consumption, our energy policies, and our responsibility to future generations.
So it's about expanding our circle of moral concern to include not just individual humans, but the planet as a whole.
Exactly. And this brings us to another fascinating frontier: artificial intelligence in healthcare. While AI has a lot of potential for improving diagnosis treatments and healthcare efficiency in general, there's a real danger of these technologies exacerbating existing inequalities if we're not careful.
Yeah, I've read about algorithmic bias and how these AI systems can perpetuate existing social prejudices. How does feminist bioethics address this?
Well, it's about bringing a critical lens to the development and deployment of these technologies. Feminist bioethicists are asking some crucial questions about who's designing these systems, what data are they being trained on, and whose values are embedded in their algorithms. They're also advocating for diverse and inclusive teams to make sure that a wider range of perspectives are being considered.
So it's about recognizing that AI isn't neutral. It's shaped by human biases. And if we're not careful, those biases will be encoded into the very fabric of our healthcare systems.
That's right. And feminist bioethics also pushes us to consider the potential impact of AI on care work. As AI takes on more tasks, it's important to consider the implications for caregivers, who are predominantly women. Will these technologies empower them or further marginalize them? Will they enhance care or lead to a dehumanization of caregiving?
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. Feminist bioethics isn't just about adding women to the bioethics conversation. It's pushing the boundaries of the field itself, forcing us to rethink these core concepts and to confront some really challenging questions about power, justice, and the future of healthcare.
And that's why it's so important for philosophers like you to engage with these ideas. Feminist bioethics challenges us to rethink our assumptions about autonomy knowledge and even just the nature of the self. It asks us to think about the complexities of power, justice, and care in a rapidly changing world.
It's a call to move beyond these abstract principles and engage with the realities of people's lives, to recognize that healthcare is not just about treating diseases, but about caring for people in all their complexity and diversity.
It's about recognizing that we are all interconnected, that our lives are shaped by these webs of relationships and social structures, and that any truly ethical approach to healthcare needs to acknowledge and address those interdependencies. It's about moving beyond that individualistic focus of traditional bioethics and embracing a more relational and holistic perspective.
And that shift in perspective, as we've seen, has really profound implications, not just for healthcare, but for our understanding of what it means to live a good life,
Right.
ethically speaking.
Yeah, that's almost like feminist bioethics is asking us to, zoom out and see the bigger picture, like how healthcare is sort of embedded in these larger systems of power and inequality.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that, healthcare doesn't exist in
Yeah.
isolation. It's shaped by, economic forces, social norms, political structures, all of which contribute to health disparities and injustices. And, for our listener who we know is a philosopher, this has got to be just fascinating territory to explore. Like we're connecting these ethical theories to actual real world problems in a way that traditional bioethics might not always do.
Absolutely. And because feminist bioethics is interdisciplinary, it draws from all these different fields like sociology, anthropology, economics, and of course philosophy to really, get a more complete understanding of these complex issues. And, you mentioned that concept of zooming out. Well, feminist bioethics asks us to zoom out even further, to think about not just human well-being, but like the well-being of the entire planet.
So now we're talking about ecofeminism
Right.
and that idea that the domination of women and the domination of nature are kind of interconnected.
Exactly. Ecofeminism is a really key part of feminist bioethics,
Mhm.
and it highlights those ethical implications of environmental degradation, particularly for women and marginalized communities who are often disproportionately affected by things like climate change and pollution.
So it's recognizing that our own personal health is, totally linked to the health of the planet, and that those same systems of oppression that harm women and other marginalized groups are also contributing to environmental destruction.
Precisely. And this interconnectedness, it goes beyond just the human realm. Feminist bioethics also asks us to think about our ethical obligations to other species, to, recognize that intrinsic value of all living beings.
So it's like expanding our circle of moral concern to encompass like the whole web of life, which for a philosopher raises all sorts of questions about the nature of value, moral status or place in the whole cosmos.
Absolutely. And that's what makes feminist bioethics so intellectually stimulating. It pushes us to grapple with these big questions, to challenge our assumptions, and imagine new ways of being in the world. It's about recognizing that ethics isn't just this theoretical exercise, it's a lived practice, a way of engaging with the world and each other.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's worth pointing out that feminist bioethics isn't just about, critiquing the systems that are already in place. It's also about creating a more just and equitable future for everyone.
That's a crucial point. Feminist bioethics isn't just about identifying problems, it's about finding solutions, working towards a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, where healthcare is accessible and equitable,
Mhm.
and where our relationship with the planet is, one of respect and reciprocity.
And for our listener who's been with us on this deep dive into feminist bioethics, I hope this has kind of sparked some new ideas, some new ways of thinking about the ethical challenges we face in healthcare and beyond.
I hope so too. I really hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and encouraged you to keep exploring this really rich and challenging field of feminist bioethics. It's constantly evolving. There's always more to learn and more to question and more to contribute. So keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
Well said. That's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.